The meeting finally broke apart in a storm of whispers and folding chairs. Deborah stayed near the front of the room, surrounded by board members and stacks of paperwork. She looked satisfied. The projector screen still glowed behind her. Maps of Oak Ridge estates covered the wall. Roads, lots, walking trails, the clubhouse, the lake. Every line on that map sat inside something much larger. I stepped outside into the evening air. The smell of cut grass drifted across the parking lot. Golf carts rolled past in small groups. Residents stood under the lights discussing what they had just seen. Most of them believed the same thing Deborah did. They believed the homeowners association controlled the community. They had no reason to think otherwise. The truth stretched far beyond the subdivision entrance. My name is Cole Mercer. 3 weeks before that meeting, I inherited 1,300 acres from my grandfather. Not a small ranch, not a single parcel. 1,300 connected acres of pasture, timber, creeks, access roads, and shoreline. The land wrapped around Oak Ridge estates like a giant horseshoe. The community sat in the middle of it. Most people never noticed. The boundaries were hidden behind tree lines, fences, and decades of assumptions. The morning after I inherited the property, I drove the perimeter alone. Gravel crunched beneath my tires. Old cattle gates stood where they had stood for years. Fence posts leaned slightly from age and weather. The land felt enormous. A narrow creek cut through the northern section. 2 ponds reflected the sky like polished glass. The main access road crossed nearly 3 miles of property before reaching the subdivision entrance. That road caught my attention immediately. Every resident used it. Every delivery truck used it. Every maintenance contractor used it. The community depended on it whether they realized it or not. A week later, I found myself standing beside an old equipment barn near the western pasture. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight coming through gaps in the walls. The air smelled like old wood and machine oil. Inside were boxes my grandfather never threw away. Survey maps, tax records, utility, agreements, handwritten notes, decades of paperwork. I spent hours sorting through them. Most of it was routine. Then I noticed something unusual. Several folders carried the Oak Ridge name, not the Modern Homeowners Association. An earlier version. Older documents. Older signatures. Older arrangements. I set them aside for later. At the time, I was more focused on learning the property itself. The land seemed to have its own memory. Old roads appeared where no road showed on modern maps. Fence lines crossed through wooded areas that no longer held livestock. Every section revealed another piece of history. The deeper I looked, the more connected everything became. That was why Deborah's presentation bothered me. She spoke about ownership as if the story started 20 years ago when the subdivision was built. It did not. The story started long before that. And somewhere inside those dusty boxes sat a detail nobody in that meeting seemed to know. One folder kept drawing my attention. The folder was thicker than the others. Dust coated the edges. The cardboard felt brittle in my hands. I carried it out of the barn and set it on the tailgate of my truck. The evening sun hung low over the pasture. Crickets had already started their chorus in the grass. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were dozens of documents. Survey drawings, correspondence, lease amendments, engineering sketches. Most were older than I was. Several pages carried signatures from people who had been gone for decades. The first few documents seemed routine. Then a familiar name appeared. Oak Ridge Development Corporation. I saw it again on another page. And another. The deeper I read, the more often it appeared. That caught my attention. A warm breeze moved across the field. The paper rustled softly. I kept reading. Back at the subdivision, Deborah Sinclair had built a reputation over the years. People listened when she spoke. Contractors returned calls quickly. Board members followed her lead without much resistance. She knew every committee, every rule, every budget meeting. Residents often treated her decisions like final authority. Even before I inherited the property, I had heard stories. Arguments over fence colors, landscaping disputes, parking violations. She always seemed to win. Most homeowners decided it was easier to comply than fight. That confidence showed at every meeting. It showed in every letter. It showed in the way she pointed at people while speaking. Deborah never acted like someone defending authority. She acted like someone who believed authority belonged to her. Meanwhile, I spent the next several days studying the old files. Mornings began with coffee and paperwork spread across my kitchen table. Afternoons ended with maps covering half the living room floor. The The smell of old paper lingered in the cabin. Some documents referenced utility access agreements. Others referenced road maintenance responsibilities. Certain pages contained handwritten notes from attorneys. Every piece connected to something larger. The pattern was beginning to emerge. Then I found a series of photographs tucked inside a manila envelope. They showed the land decades earlier. No subdivision, no clubhouse, no entrance monument, just open pasture and timber. In one photograph, a survey crew stood beside wooden stakes marking future boundaries. Someone had written dates on the back. Another photograph showed construction equipment arriving years later. A third showed the first paved section of the access road. I laid the photographs beside modern maps. The overlap was impossible to ignore. The community existed because agreements had once been made with the owner of the surrounding land. Without those agreements, the project never would have happened. That realization changed the way I viewed everything Deborah was doing. The issue was no longer about HOA rules. It was about foundations. The next afternoon, a certified letter arrived at my mailbox. The envelope carried the association logo in the corner. The paper inside was direct. Deborah wanted a meeting. Not a public meeting. A private one. And the timing felt very deliberate. I received the letter on a Thursday afternoon. The mailbox door snapped shut with a metallic click as I pulled the envelope free. The association logo sat neatly in the corner. Heavy paper. Certified delivery. Deborah wanted to make a point before I even opened it. A warm wind moved through the trees lining the driveway. The smell of fresh hay drifted across the pasture. I stood beside the truck and read every word. The invitation sounded polite on the surface. Private discussion. Community concerns. Future cooperation. The language was carefully chosen. The timing was not. Deborah wanted the meeting before the next board session. That detail stood out immediately. 2 days later, I drove to the clubhouse. The parking lot was nearly empty. No residents. No public audience. Just Deborah and 3 board members waiting inside a conference room overlooking the lake. Sunlight reflected off the water beyond the windows. The air smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish. A stack of folders sat in front of each chair. Deborah greeted me with a practiced smile. The kind people use when they believe they already know how the conversation will end. We sat down. The room fell quiet. Deborah started speaking almost immediately. She talked about community standards, future growth, shared interests, maintaining harmony. Every sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they pointed toward a single objective. She wanted control over additional portions of the surrounding land. One board member slid a document across the table. Another opened a map. Colored lines stretched across roads, fields, and wooded sections I knew by heart. Several marked areas extended beyond the subdivision boundaries. Far beyond, Deborah tapped the map with a polished fingernail. She described future walking trails, expanded recreational access, new development opportunities. Her confidence never wavered. Then she mentioned the access road. The room became noticeably quieter. That road connected the entire community to the outside world. School buses used it. Delivery trucks used it. Emergency services used it. Deborah spoke as if its future was already settled. I listened without interrupting. The projector hummed softly in the corner. Papers shifted across the table. One board member avoided eye contact. Another seemed unusually nervous. That caught my attention. Deborah eventually presented a proposal. She wanted me to sign an agreement granting expanded usage rights across several sections of the property. Not a temporary arrangement. A long-term commitment. The document was thicker than I expected. I flipped through it slowly. Survey exhibits. Access provisions. Maintenance clauses. Additional pages referenced future infrastructure projects. The deeper I read, the more ambitious the proposal became. Deborah watched closely. She clearly expected resistance. Instead, I closed the folder and thanked her for the information. That seemed to surprise her more than any argument could have. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside, a lawn crew passed near the clubhouse entrance. The distant hum of equipment drifted through the windows. Deborah finally leaned forward and asked when she could expect an answer. I told her I needed time to review everything carefully. Her smile tightened slightly. The meeting ended a few minutes later. As I walked back toward my truck, one detail from the proposal stayed with me. It referenced an agreement that sounded very familiar. I had seen that name somewhere before. The drive back from the clubhouse took nearly 40 minutes. Gravel popped beneath the tires as I followed the ranch road through rolling pasture. The sun was sinking behind the tree line. Long shadows stretched across the fields. Deborah's proposal sat on the passenger seat beside me. I kept glancing at one specific page, not because of what it requested, because of a reference buried near the bottom. I had seen that document title before. The moment I reached the house, I carried the proposal inside and spread everything across the dining room table. The smell of old paper filled the room again. Maps overlapped maps. Survey drawings covered half the surface. Outside, the wind rattled the porch screen. I started searching through the boxes from the barn. One folder became 3. 3 became 10. Hours passed. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked each hour with a soft chime. Then I found it. The same agreement. The same title. The same property description. My hand stopped moving. I pulled the document free and read it from the beginning. Every page revealed another piece of the puzzle. The original developers had never purchased large sections of the surrounding land. They had negotiated access instead. Road access, utility access, recreational access, long-term land use access. Everything depended on a master lease agreement executed decades earlier. I read the signatures twice. Then a third time. My grandfather's name appeared at the bottom of the final page. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I carried the document to the kitchen and made fresh coffee. Rain began tapping lightly against the windows. The lease was far more detailed than I expected. Multiple amendments had been added over the years. Most adjusted maintenance responsibilities. Some updated legal descriptions. Then I reached a section highlighted in faded yellow marker. Someone had flagged it long ago. The language was simple, clear, difficult to misunderstand. The property owner retained authority to review and adjust land use rental rates at specified intervals. I leaned back in my chair and read the clause again. Then again. My grandfather had never exercised that right. Neither had anyone else. The rate had remained virtually unchanged for years. That explained something that had bothered me since inheriting the property. The numbers never made sense. Thousands of residents benefited from access arrangements negotiated generations earlier. Yet the compensation remained frozen in another era. Rain intensified outside. Water rolled down the glass. I pulled additional financial records from a nearby box. The comparison was startling. Property values had climbed. Association revenues had climbed. Home prices had climbed. The lease rate barely moved at all. A soft knock interrupted my concentration. My attorney, Michael Turner, arrived carrying a leather briefcase. I had asked him to review several documents earlier that week. We spent the next 2 hours going page by page through the agreement. Michael rarely reacted strongly to paperwork. This time he did. He adjusted his glasses and sat quietly for several seconds after finishing the lease. Finally, he looked up. His expression told me everything. Deborah had built her strategy on assumptions. The actual documents told a very different story. Then Michael pointed to one date near the bottom of the final amendment. Michael tapped the date with the tip of his pen. Rain continued drumming against the windows behind him. The kitchen light reflected across the stack of documents covering the table. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he slid the lease toward me. The adjustment provision was not only valid. It was current, fully enforceable. No expiration issue. No missing amendment. No conflicting language buried elsewhere. The clause remained exactly where my grandfather had left it. I read the date again. Every required review period had passed. Every condition had been satisfied. The authority to reevaluate the rate belonged to the property owner. That owner was now me. Michael leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. The smell of coffee lingered in the room. He explained the situation carefully. The lease created obligations on both sides. Access rights, usage rights, development rights. But the rental structure had never been modernized. Decades had passed. Property values exploded. Community growth accelerated. New amenities appeared. Hundreds of homes were built. Yet the underlying land arrangement remained trapped in another era. The numbers were impossible to ignore. The following morning, fog covered the lower pasture. I drove across the property before sunrise. Gravel crunched beneath the truck tires. Deer moved through the tree line near the creek. The subdivision entrance came into view as the first light touched the horizon. Residents were beginning their day. School buses entered through the gate. Delivery trucks followed. Landscapers arrived with trailers. The entire community flowed through land governed by agreements most people had never seen. That realization stayed with me. None of the homeowners had created the situation. Most did not even know it existed. Deborah was different. She had built months of pressure around assumptions she never verified. She sent letters, organized meetings, presented maps, requested expanded rights. Yet she never checked the foundation beneath any of it. By the end of the week, Michael completed a full review package, updated valuations, market comparisons, historical records, lease calculations. Everything was documented. Everything was supported. Nothing relied on opinion. We met again in his office on Friday afternoon. The scent of printer toner filled the room. Fresh reports covered the conference table. Sunlight reflected off the glass windows overlooking Main Street. Michael reviewed the final figures one last time. The adjustment was significant, very significant, but every number came directly from the agreement and current land value analysis. No shortcuts, no exaggeration, no punishment, just math. Outside, traffic moved slowly through town. Inside, the room remained quiet. I signed several authorization pages. Michael organized the documents into a formal notification package. The process felt surprisingly ordinary considering how much it would affect the community. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody celebrated. We simply followed the agreement. Late that evening, I returned home carrying the finalized paperwork. The ranch was silent except for insects humming near the pond. A cool breeze moved through the trees. I stood on the porch and looked toward the distant lights of Oak Ridge Estates. Hundreds of families were settling into their evening routines. Most had no idea what was coming. Deborah certainly did not. On Monday morning, every homeowner would receive the same letter, and every conversation in the community would change. Monday morning arrived with a layer of fog hanging over the fields. The mailbox at the subdivision entrance filled faster than usual. Delivery trucks rolled through the gate. Residents collected newspapers, coffee, and the same envelope waiting in each mailbox. By 8 o'clock, phones were already ringing. I was standing near the old equipment barn when the first call came in. Then another. Then 3 more. The sound of notifications echoed from my phone every few minutes. A cool breeze moved across the pasture. Somewhere beyond the trees, a tractor engine started up. The community had finally received the notice. The document was straightforward. No threats. No emotional language. No surprises hidden in fine print. It explained the lease review. It explained the updated valuation. It explained the revised rental structure. Every figure was supported. Every page referenced the same agreement that had governed the land for decades. The reaction was immediate. Around lunchtime, I drove toward town for a meeting with Michael. As I passed the subdivision entrance, small groups of residents stood near the clubhouse parking lot. Some held copies of the notice. Others stared at their phones. Nobody looked relaxed. The atmosphere felt completely different from the confidence I had seen only weeks earlier. The clubhouse itself seemed unusually busy. Vehicles filled spaces normally empty during the workday. Word had spread quickly. By early afternoon, Michael received requests from multiple attorneys representing homeowners. Most asked the same questions. Was the lease real? Was the adjustment valid? Had there been an error? The answers remained unchanged. The agreement was real. The review process was valid. The calculations were documented. One attorney requested copies of historical amendments. Another asked for supporting valuations. Everything was provided. The paperwork spoke for itself. Later that evening, Oak Ridge held an emergency board meeting. I did not attend. I did not need to. Several residents called afterward. Their descriptions painted a clear picture. The meeting lasted for hours. Voices were raised. Questions came from every direction. Deborah attempted to reassure the room. She insisted solutions would be found. She insisted negotiations were possible. She insisted the board was reviewing options. Yet one question kept returning. Why had nobody known about the lease? That question seemed to follow her throughout the entire meeting. The following day brought even more scrutiny. Residents started reviewing old association records. Former board members received phone calls. Financial committees requested documents. Community message boards filled with discussions. The focus shifted away from me and toward the people who had ignored the underlying agreement for years. Deborah suddenly found herself answering questions instead of asking them. The pressure continued building. Midweek, Michael forwarded a legal memorandum prepared by one of the association's outside firms. I read it twice. The conclusion was concise. The lease remained enforceable. The adjustment authority remained enforceable. The community's position was weaker than many residents expected. Outside my window, rain began falling across the pasture. Water tapped softly against the roof. The land looked exactly the same as it had a month earlier. The roads remained in place. The homes remained in place. The difference was that people finally understood who controlled the ground beneath them. Then Deborah scheduled another community meeting. The community meeting took place on a humid Thursday evening. Every parking space around the clubhouse was filled before sunset. Pickup trucks lined the access road. Golf carts crowded the grass near the entrance. The air smelled like fresh mulch and approaching rain. Residents gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices while holding copies of the lease documents. The atmosphere felt nothing like the meetings Deborah used to control. Inside, every chair was occupied. People stood along the walls. Others watched through open doors from the hallway. The projector screen glowed at the front of the room. Deborah sat beside the board members with several binders stacked in front of her. She looked tired for the first time since I had met her. The room settled into silence as the meeting began. Deborah opened with prepared remarks. She spoke about ongoing reviews, future negotiations, community stability. Her words sounded careful, measured, yet nobody seemed interested in speeches anymore. They wanted answers. The first question came from a retired accountant sitting near the front. He asked when the board first became aware of the lease provisions. Deborah hesitated before answering. That hesitation changed the room. More hands immediately went up. A second resident asked why the agreement had never been disclosed during previous budget discussions. A third wanted to know why long-term planning documents ignored the rental adjustment clause entirely. The questions arrived faster than the answers. Papers rustled throughout the room. Someone flipped through a copy of the lease. Another resident held up old meeting minutes. Deborah tried to regain control. She insisted the board had acted in good faith. She emphasized that legal reviews were ongoing. Yet every response created new questions. The projector displayed financial summaries as committee members attempted to explain the situation. Numbers filled the screen. Reserve funds, maintenance obligations, community expenses. Then another issue surfaced. Several residents noticed projected future budgets relied on assumptions that no longer worked under the updated lease structure. The discussion shifted again. People stopped talking about me. They stopped talking about the land. They started talking about governance, oversight, accountability. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One quietly reviewed documents while another stared at the table. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Rain tapped against the clubhouse windows. The tension inside continued building. By the end of the evening, a formal review committee had been proposed. Independent financial consultants were requested. Several residents openly called for leadership changes during the next election cycle. Deborah remained seated through all of it. Her authority seemed smaller with every passing minute. When the meeting finally ended, nobody lingered to congratulate the board. Small groups formed in the parking lot beneath the lights. Conversations continued long after dark. The following week brought more developments. Attorneys completed their reviews. Financial consultants issued preliminary findings. Every report pointed in the same direction. The lease was valid. The adjustment was valid. The community would need to adapt. One afternoon, Michael called while I was repairing a fence near the northern pasture. The smell of fresh-cut cedar filled the air. His voice sounded calmer than it had in weeks. He told me the association had reached a decision. And this time, Deborah was not the one delivering it. Michael called just before sunset. I was replacing a section of fence along the northern pasture when the phone vibrated in my pocket. The smell of fresh cedar mixed with the scent of dry grass. A light breeze moved across the field. I leaned against the fence post and answered. Michael did not waste time. The association had completed its review. Independent consultants had finished their reports. Outside counsel had delivered final recommendations. After weeks of meetings, arguments, and document reviews, the board had voted to accept the revised lease structure and begin negotiations under the updated terms. I looked across the pasture toward the distant tree line. For a moment, the only sound was wind moving through the grass. The fight that Deborah started had finally reached its conclusion. A few days later, the clubhouse hosted another community meeting. This one felt different from the moment I arrived. The parking lot was full, but the tension was gone. People stood in small groups talking quietly. No one seemed interested in assigning blame anymore. They wanted stability. They wanted facts. They wanted a path forward. Inside, the atmosphere was calm. Financial reports were presented. Long-term planning proposals were discussed. New oversight procedures were approved. Residents asked practical questions and received direct answers. The room felt more like a community and less like a battlefield. Then another announcement came. Deborah would not seek another term as president. A quiet murmur moved through the audience. There was no dramatic reaction, no celebration, no outrage, just acceptance. The community had already moved on. The focus was now on rebuilding trust and managing the future responsibly. Over the following months, several things changed. New board members were elected. Financial committees became more transparent. Historical agreements were reviewed and organized. Residents gained access to information that had previously been ignored or forgotten. The lease that had remained buried for decades became one of the most discussed documents in the community. Not because people feared it, because people finally understood it. Meanwhile, life on the ranch returned to normal. The ponds reflected the morning sky. Cattle moved through the lower fields. Delivery trucks continued, using the same access road. School buses followed the same route every day. The land itself had not changed. It never needed to. One afternoon, I returned to the old equipment barn where the entire story had truly begun. Dust still floated through the sunlight. The boxes remained stacked against the wall. The same folder sat on a shelf nearby. I picked it up and flipped through the pages once more. The photographs, the surveys, the agreements. Every answer had been there from the beginning. People simply stopped looking. As the sun settled behind the western pasture, I closed the folder and carried it back to the shelf. Outside, the lights of Oak Ridge Estates began to glow in the distance. Families were cooking dinner. Children were riding bicycles. Life continued exactly as it should. The land still belonged to the same owner. The difference was that everyone finally knew it. And that knowledge changed everything.